The venison was thawing through the burlap, oozing lukewarm blood down Vaelia's wrists. She stood in the service yard, the wind from the northern peaks blowing against her hunched shoulders. It was the kind of cold that made your teeth ache. Her gray wool tunic was thin enough to let light through the weave. Her boots had been soaked through with slush an hour ago. She couldn't feel her toes anymore, which was likely a blessing. A gust of laughter drifted down from the upper terrace. Vaelia looked down at the frozen mud. 3 women from the winter court were cutting across the yard, yards of crimson and violet silk trailing through the dirty snow without lifting their hems. They smelled of cloves and rosewater, an expensive, heavy scent that seemed so out of place among the coal bins and horse dung. They didn't glance at her. Why should they? The stable hands were merely moving furniture. "Did you hear him dismiss the Lady of the West?" said one. Her voice floated easily on the thin air. In the middle of her petition, 12 years of these trials, and the man remains a barbarian. They entered the great hall through the oak doors. They carried with them the smell of rosewater. The doors slammed shut behind them with a heavy thud. The wind. Vaelia blew her nose on her sleeve and made for the stables. Old Bram stood leaning against the stone doorframe, looking like a corpse left standing by mistake. His skin was gray, clammy with fever sweat in the freezing wind, and his chest rattled with each breath. He spat a dark string of phlegm into the dirt and nodded toward the dripping sack in her arms. "Take that down to the lower pens," he huffed. Then he bent over, coughing so that he almost fell. Vaelia halted. "The lower pens? Nobody goes down there, Bram." He wiped his mouth with a trembling hand. "The Emperor's hound hasn't eaten since Tuesday. It nearly took Marcus's hand off when he tried to slide the trough in. The boys ran off this morning when they heard the growl. If that beast starves, Zaelen will have my head on a pike, and yours next to it. Just throw the meat over the partition and run." He pushed her towards the cellar door. It wasn't so hard, but she tripped anyway, the sack heavy against her chest. She wasn't in the position to say no. If Bram died of the lung rot, she'd be out on the mountain roads by the end of winter, with no coin and no reference. She swung open the heavy cellar door and started down the stairs. It was salty and mildewy down there. The first bend was lit by the sun, but beyond that, it was replaced by the greasy, guttering yellow of a single tallow candle stuck to the wall. At the foot of the stairwell were the iron doors to the holding vault. Something had tried to dig its way through the solid iron, and the metal was scored with deep white scratches. A wooden beam as thick as a man's thigh blocked the door, but she could hear movement on the other side, a heavy slide, dragging over stone. She was shaking so badly she dropped the candle from her hands. It sputtered to a stop in a puddle of snowmelt. In the dark, she put her hand on the wooden beam, took a breath, and pulled it back. The door opened, its hinges screaming. It smelled like an old butcher shop, copper and rotting fat, and the musky, wet dog smell of an animal that hadn't had fresh air in months. Vaelia stood in the doorway, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. The vault was immense, dimly lighted by narrow iron grates high near the ceiling, where the snow sifted in. She thought for a moment the room was empty. Then the rumbling began. It wasn't the growl of a regular dog. It was a low-frequency hum, vibrating through the soles of her boots and in the pit of her stomach. 2 eyes in the far corner opened, pale, sickly yellow, reflecting the gray light from the grates. Around them was a huge shape, easily the size of a heifer, all thick shoulders and bristling dark fur. It took a step closer to her. The stone floor trembled slightly. Then there was a sharp clink scrape, and the wolf's foreleg buckled. It exhaled a short wet hiss through its teeth and settled itself back down onto its haunches. Vaelia did not run. Her fear didn't disappear, but her heart was beating so hard she could hear it in her ears, and that scrape changed things. She had heard that precise metallic drag 100 times in the winter woods surrounding her village, a bear trap. She squinted into the void. An ancient iron jaw trap clamped just above the paw of the wolf's left front leg. The teeth had sunk deep through the fur to the meat, the leg swelling to almost twice its normal size, the fur around it matted black with dried blood. The chain had broken, leaving 3 feet of iron links to drag behind the animal as it moved. It snarled at her, a low string of spittle hanging from its black gum line. It had been trapped, panicked, fevered. Vaelia dropped the burlap bag to the floor. Slowly she knelt, drawing her feet under her to make herself as small as possible. "You're a mess, aren't you?" she said. Her voice sounded thin and shaky in the echoing vault. so she dropped it lower, taking the cadence Bram used when he was calming a spooked stallion. That must fucking hurt. The beast snapped at the air, heard two rocks crashing together as its jaws clicked together. But Vaelia didn't stir. Without looking, she stuck her hand into the sack, and her fingers squelched into the cold, wet deer meat, and pulled out a 4-pound chunk of flank. She placed it on the flagstones about 3 feet in front of her knees, then pulled her hands back, resting them on her thighs, palms up. "Eat," she murmured. "Besides, I'm too skinny to be worth the trouble." The wolf stayed still a long time. Its nostrils flared, reading the air. The blood from the venison, the tallow on her sleeves, the sharp scent of her sweat. Slowly, agonizingly, it pulled itself forward, the iron chain clanking against the stone. It didn't jump. It stretched out its huge neck, gripped the meat with its fangs, and pulled it back into the shadows. For several seconds, there was the sound of wet chewing and tearing bone. When it was over, the wolf did not withdraw. It fell forward, front legs folding, and let its heavy chin fall onto the stone floor at Vaelia's boots. Shallow, wet breath. Vaelia sat, watching its chest rise and fall for a minute. Then, very slowly, she reached out and touched the coarse fur on the top of its head. The wolf stopped moving. It snorted, a long, shuddering blast of breath from its nose that sent dust across her boots. "Good boy," she whispered. "He doesn't usually like strangers." The voice was coming from the darkness behind the iron pillar to her right. Vaelia scrambled backwards, so fast her palms scraped on the stone, her heart leaping up into her throat. Out, from the shadow of the stone support pillar, stepped a man. He'd been sitting on an overturned salt crate, saying nothing. Vaelia could not make out his face in the dim light, only the outline of broad shoulders beneath a plain black leather work tunic and a pair of tall, grease-stained riding boots. He stank of wood smoke and leather oil. Then he stepped into the gray light which came down from the ceiling grate, and she saw his eyes. They were a curious clear silver, as if tin were polished. Zaelen. Vaelia's stomach fell out of her. She flung herself down onto the floor, pressing her forehead hard into the freezing flagstones, her hands splayed either side of her head. Her mind ran over the executions Bram would gossip about over supper, the people who had looked the Emperor in the eye, who had loitered in the private courtyard, who had touched his warhounds without permission. "Mercy, Your Grace," she addressed the floor, the words muffled and hurried. "Bram's got the fever. He couldn't come up the stairs. I only brought the meat." "Get up," he said. His voice was not loud, but it had that heavy flat timbre that brooked no argument. Vaelia hauled herself up onto her knees, staring at the salt stains at the hem of his trousers. He walked up and stood looking down at the wolf. The animal did not growl at him, but only moved its heavy head a little, its tail thumping once feebly against the floor. "How did you know he wasn't going to take your arm off?" "He was dragging his left side, Your Grace," she whispered to his boots. Zaelen asked. "Unless you corner an animal, you will not jump it with a trapped leg." He was simply hungry. Zaelen was quiet for a second. She heard the faint creak of his leather tunic as he moved his weight. "Look at me." Vaelia slowly raised her head. The Emperor was younger than she thought, maybe 30. His face was pale and hard-jawed, like it had been carved out of old wood and forgotten in the rain. His hair was pulled back carelessly with a leather string, and a thin white scar crossed his left eyebrow. He wasn't looking at her face. He was looking at her hands, covered in dried deer blood, shaking with cold. He did not ask who she was, nor why her uniform was falling apart. He simply turned to the open doorway and said, "Vanguard." 2 soldiers came down the stairs fast, chainmail jingling, spears dipped, and ready to strike. They stopped at the door and looked. The Emperor, the injured beast, and a dirty kitchen girl on her knees. "Bring her up to the residential wing," Zaelen said, waving vaguely at Vaelia. "Tell the housekeeper to get her bathed and to find her some clothes that fit." The soldiers exchanged glances, then looked at Vaelia. One of them dropped his spear and moved toward her. Vaelia's brains scrambled to keep up. "Stop, Your Grace, please. If I don't finish mucking out the lower stalls, the steward will dock Bram's pay. We don't have enough firewood for the week as it is." Zaelen glanced back at her. The eyes were pale silver and completely inscrutable. Softly, he said, "Bram's wood is none of your affair any longer. You work for me now." Turning his back on her, he bent down over the caught leg of the wolf and looked at the iron jaws. The soldier took Vaelia by the elbow, not roughly but not gently either, and led her to the stairs. She turned once to look back as they took her away into the corridor, but the Emperor did not look up again. The heavy iron doors closed behind them, shutting out the smell of old blood and salt. The hot water in the copper basin wasn't right. Vaelia sat on the edge of the bed, knees drawn up to her chin. The maids had scrubbed the horse grease off her forearms with coarse soap until the skin was pink, then dumped a midnight blue wool dress over her head. It was thick and heavy with the smell of cedar chests and lavender. There was a fire roaring in the fireplace, giving off such intense heat into the small room that she was sweating under her hair. But still she could not stop shivering. The quiet of the residential wing was the kind of quiet Bram's old hunting dog made just before he bit someone. The scent of copper and wolf spit still lingered on her fingers, close to her face. She looked down at the blue weave of the rug beneath her bare feet, waiting for a steward to realize that some idiot had put a stable girl in the guest quarters and send the guards to haul her back to the muck. Down the hall, iron-heeled boots clicked on stone. Vaelia flinched and slipped off the bed. She padded over to the heavy oak door and pressed her ear to the wood. She squinted through the narrow gap in the hinges. Zaelen was out in the corridor. The three women from the courtyard turned toward him. Their red and purple silk skirts looked absurd against the rough, sooty stone of the fortress walls, like tropical birds in a sheepfold. Their perfume of rosewater drifted through the crack of the hinges, thick enough to make Vaelia want to sneeze. "Your Grace," the Lady of the West was saying. Her voice was an octave lower than it had been in the yard. Soft, intimate, practiced. Her fingers stretched out, stopping a half-inch from the iron rivets of his breastplate. "We sat for hours in the antechamber. The magistrates say the trials. Clear the corridor." He did not raise his voice. He just threw the words out into the space between them. The woman's hands stopped. Her smile grew tight till her lips were white. "But, my lord, the Winter Council needs a—" "Get out," Zaelen said again. He didn't move, didn't touch the sword at his belt, but all three women moved back a step anyway. "If I see you loitering outside my quarters again, I'll have the sentries toss you in the lower courtyard. Go." Vaelia held her breath. A nasty little knot of satisfaction twisted in her chest. These were the same people that walked by her like she was a pile of shit 3 hours ago. Now they were lifting their silk skirts and running down the corridor as fast as their slippers would carry them, looking terrified. Their footsteps faded away, and Zaelen turned his head slightly towards Vaelia's door. He said nothing, but his eyes were locked on the precise point where she was peering through the hinges. He knew she was there. He knew all the time. Vaelia gasped and scrambled backwards, slipping on the rug and falling flat on her palms. She sat there on the floor watching the iron latch, waiting for it to go up. It did not. The heavy thump of his boots just went on past her door and faded away toward the master chambers at the end of the wing. Vaelia tucked her knees back up to her chest. She didn't fit here. She was just Bram's muck in borrowed dress. Give him a week, and he'd be staring at her with that same flat, disgusted face, and telling the guards to dump her out in the snow too. She kept wake until the logs in the hearth had burned to gray coals. Her eyes were just about to close when there was a crash at the end of the hall. It sounded like an axe splitting a dry pine. Another crash rattled the floorboards beneath her feet. Something heavy hit stone. Vaelia didn't hesitate to weigh the gallows against his temper. That wasn't the sound of human anger. She had heard it often enough in the winter stalls when a horse's leg was caught in the kicking chains, and it went blind with panic. The sound of an animal tearing itself apart, unable to escape from the dark. She threw open her door and ran down the cold stone corridor. 2 Vanguard guards stood outside the Emperor's double doors. On either side of the entrance they were pressed against the wall of stone, their faces under their iron caps blanched, their spears trembling in their grasp. "Don't go in there, girl," said one, catching her sleeve as she touched the latch. "He's got the night fever again. He had a fit like this last month and broke Marcus's collarbone. When the beast gets him, he's unreasoned with." Vaelia looked at the soldier's shaking hand, then twisted her arm until her sleeve was torn away. She rested her shoulder against the heavy oak doors and pressed down on the iron handle. It was cold in the room. The leaded glass windows had been broken out from the inside, and a drift of fine snow blew across the floorboards. In the center of the room, the heavy oak writing table had been split in half, chairs smashed against the masonry. Zaelen was on his knees in the midst of the debris. He wore his leather work tunic, both hands in his hair, pulling it hard enough to tear the roots. He was heaving with short, irregular gasps, and a low, wet rumble was rattling in his throat. The same vibration the dire wolf had made down in the cellar. His silver eyes were wide and utterly blank, fixed on the floorboards, without seeing them. He lunged for the remains of a heavy bedpost, his knuckles already split and bleeding from the wood, and drove his fist into the grain. Vaelia stepped inside, closing the thick doors behind her. The latch clicked. Zaelen. She had no title. Her voice was flat and low, with the same rhythm that Bram used to calm a spook stallion. The Emperor turned around. His teeth gleamed. A coarse, guttural growl tore from his chest. He looked as if he was going to tear her throat out for coming into his space. Vaelia didn't stop moving. She stepped over the broken table legs, keeping her hands open and visible at her sides. "I know," she said softly, closing the distance until she was standing within his reach. "I know it hurts, but no one's after you here." He was breathing loud and ragged, his shoulders locked tight, as if he were waiting for a blow from a spear. Vaelia reached out with care and pressed her palm flat against the leather of his tunic, directly over the heavy throb of his heart. "Breathe," she told him. Nothing happened for a moment. Zaelen took a deep, panting breath then, like a man breaking through the ice of a river. The wild, empty look went out of his eyes all at once, and was replaced by a sudden, exhausting clarity. He looked down at her small, calloused hand on his chest. He did not push her away. Instead, his hand went up and closed about her wrist. His fingers were slick with blood from his scraped knuckles, and his grip tight enough to bruise her skin, but not violent. It was hopeless. He bowed his head forward until his forehead rested on her shoulder, and his heavy frame shuddered once, gradually his breathing coming into harmony with hers. By the time the squires arrived, the broken glass was leaking gray morning light. Vaelia stood with her hands in her sleeves, before the cold hearth. The helplessness of the previous night had vanished without a trace. Zaelen stood in the center of the room, hard-lined and expressionless, while two boys buckled him into his iron combat plates. He was the warlord on the copper coins again, cold and sharp and so far away. He didn't look at the boys who were helping him. The last leather strap buckled, he made a little flick of his fingers, and they hurried out of the room, eyes on the floorboards. Zaelen looked at Vaelia. "We are going to the council room." It was not an invitation. Vaelia's stomach clenched. "Your Grace, I have no clothes for the court sitting. I don't understand military maps. I don't know anybody there." "You don't have to." He moved closer, smelling of saddle soap and iron armor. He looked down at her hands, twisting the wool fabric of her skirts nervously. "You stand by my chair," he said plainly. "Don't roam." He turned and went out into the corridor. Vaelia had no choice but to follow, her bare feet making no sound on the stones, while his iron-tipped boots echoed the length of the hall. As they approached the public wing, the air grew warmer and smelt of tallow candles and roasted meat. The quiet of the residential halls was broken by the low, steady drone of several hundred people talking at once. They arrived at the double doors of the great hall. The sentries opened them up. The chatter within died the moment it was heard. Vaelia watched the back of Zaelen's cloak as he led her down the central aisle to the black stone throne at the far end of the room. The hall was crowded with regional commanders, city magistrates, and wealthy landowners from the southern provinces. They wore thick furs, velvet coats, and heavy gold chains around their necks. All heads turned to see them pass. Their stares scorched her face like heat. She felt small and grubby, and all wrong. She wanted to sink into the floorboards. Zaelen mounted the steps to the throne, but did not sit, just lodged 2 fingers in the empty space to the right of the heavy stone chair. Vaelia climbed on the platform and stopped, following his lead. No jewelry, no hair oil, no family crest, a scullery maid in a borrowed woolen frock, standing at the right hand of the most feared man in the north. For a long time the hall was silent. Vaelia looked down at the people. The shock was already wearing off, and the faces were changing. Narrowed eyes, lips turned down. A man much older, with a marten fur collar, leaned to whisper behind his glove to a woman in green velvet, eyes on Vaelia's bare feet. She felt their resentment settle in the room like a cold draft. Even before Zaelen had called the meeting to order, the noise in the great hall made Vaelia's teeth ache. She sat on an iron 3-legged stool pushed up against the side of Zaelen's chair. The fireplaces roared, and the room was full of the smell of scorched fat and stale ale, and the sharp minty oil the southern ladies wore in their hair. At least 200 people were squeezed onto the benches below the dais. They ate too quickly, spoke too loudly, but every few minutes someone would stop and look up at the kitchen girl who sat next to the warlord. Vaelia tucked her hands between her knees, so no one would see the shaking fingers. Her woolen dress was too thick for the room, and her bare feet were cold on the stone riser. She ceased to watch the people, and looked at the dogs. 3 old hunting mastiffs lay by the central hearth, gnawing a rib cage Bram had thrown them from the kitchens. The only honest sound in the room was the wet, rhythmic cracking of bone. Dogs were simple. They ate when they were hungry, they slept when they were done with you. They didn't watch you from the corner of their eye, pretending to listen to a lecture about grain taxes. An old man in a fur-trimmed doublet, reading from a long sheet of parchment, stood on the bottom step of the platform. The man was saying, "Your Grace, if we don't reinforce the western checkpoints by harvest, the mountain tribes will take the sheep before they even reach the shearing sheds." He sounded like a schoolmaster reading out a list of penalties. There must be 3 companies of foot soldiers on the gorge. Zaelen was not listening to him. He sat with his elbow on the arm of his chair and his chin in his fist, watching Vaelia, watching the mastiffs. "The brindled one," he said. He didn't shout it, but his voice rang out. The man with the parchment stopped in the middle of a word. 2 men bickering over dice by the wine casks stopped their argument. 10 seconds later, half the hall was straining to hear what the Emperor said to the girl with no shoes. Vaelia's ears were hot. Her eyes were fixed on the dog's ears. "He's dragging his back leg," she whispered back without looking up. "The old break from the boar hunt is affecting him with the damp. If you don't heat the gristle by wading him through the sulfur springs before you take him out next week, he'll get lame on the ridge." Zaelen gave a low noise in his throat that might have been assent. "Tell Bram to take him to the baths after the morning feed." He did not look at the parchment man. Instead, he bent over to the table beside his chair and took his own silver water jug and filled Vaelia's empty tin cup to the brim. The water hitting the metal was very loud. A ripple of low, indistinct talk ran through the room like wind through dry grass. They came closer, their eyes flicking from the tin cup to Zaelen's face. Up north, a warlord didn't take orders from his own captains, let alone a girl who smelled of horse liniment. Before the old man could begin reading his list again, a soldier stepped out from behind the table in front. He wore the black plate armor of the Vanguard command, but over his shoulders had pinned a clean white wool cloak that hadn't seen rain or mud. His temples were graying, his hair was cut very short, and he moved with the loose, easy balance of a man who spent 5 hours a day in the training yards. He climbed the dais steps and gave Zaelen a curt military nod, not a bow. "You always did have better luck with hounds than horses, Zaelen." His voice was dry and pleasant, as if he were talking to an old friend at supper. Then he turned to Vaelia. "I don't think we've been introduced." Zaelen didn't lean back, but the drumming of his fingers on the arm of his chair ceased. "Have your say, Marcus, and take your seat." The general didn't seem offended. He looked again at Vaelia. Close up he smelled of clean linen and iron polish, not of the mint oil the others used. His gray eyes took in the coarse weave of her dress, the old burn scar on her wrist, the tallow under her fingernails. "The court is a miserable place if you are not born to it," Marcus said to her. He sounded really sorry for her. All this noise after the stillness of the lower yard. "It's like being chucked in a kennel with the dogs fighting over the scraps." Vaelia glanced at his iron breastplate. "I'm just here to assist with the hounds, sir." Marcus smiled a little. It wasn't a mean smile. Somehow that made it worse. "Of course you are. And the master of the hounds too, so Bram tells me." He leaned a few inches nearer, his voice dropping, so the old man with the parchment could not hear. "The boys in the barracks were talking over last night. They said you got him into bed without nobody breaking a bone this time." "That's a good gig. Indeed, he hasn't had a whole night's sleep since the winter campaign." Vaelia said nothing. Her fingers were tight around the rim of her tin cup. "Don't let him get the better of you, girl," Marcus whispered. His voice was very gentle at this moment, like an uncle giving advice on a bad trade. "When the room starts to whirl, a man with the war fever will clutch at anything that is still. You are a cold compress on a feverish brow. It feels good while it lasts, the headache, but nobody marries the rag they use to wipe their brow when the sickness is over. He straightened and gave her a formal, polite nod that was usually reserved for the wives of the magistrates. "Good night, Zaelen," Marcus called over his shoulder. Without waiting for an answer, he walked back down the steps and sat down at the high table. Vaelia stared at the water in her tin cup. The harpists began again, some long, slow ballad of a river, and the people returned to their mutton. But now the food just smelled like grease to her. No one marries a rag. She glanced at Zaelen's hand on the stone chair. His knuckles were white and scarred from old breaks. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the door at the back of the room with the hard, empty stare he got when he was tired. Marcus was correct. Zaelen did not know her family name. He didn't care a damn what she thought about the taxes on sheep. He just wanted someone sitting there with him, who didn't smell like mint oil, who didn't ask him questions when his head hurt. Around midnight, the hall cleared out. The heat of the hearths made the corridor out freezing. 3 paces back from Zaelen, Vaelia watched the heels of his boots strike the stone. Usually she walked fast enough to be even with his elbow, but her feet felt heavy tonight. They were at the turn by the laundry rooms, just as a kitchen boy appeared from the stairwell, carrying a wooden tub full of dirty pewter mugs. The boy was looking down at his feet, trying not to slip on the wet stones, and walked right into Zaelen's side. The tub fell. 30 mugs of heavy metal struck the masonry together, bouncing and clattering on the floor, like iron pipes dropped from a wagon. Zaelen jerked back so hard his shoulder hit the wall. His hand went right to his belt, where he didn't have a sword tonight, and a low, rough growl came out of his throat. His eyes widened, turning gray in the dim light, his chest heaving as he stared at the boy on the floor, amongst the rolling mugs. He looked as if he would drive his boot into the kid's ribs. Vaelia never thought about it. She just moved. She stood halfway between Zaelen and the boy, her hands flat against the leather of Zaelen's vest. She pushed him an inch back against the wall. "Zaelen, don't." Her voice was thin, but it carried over the last mug rolling into the gutter. Zaelen seized her wrists. His grip was like a vice, and she sucked in her breath as the fingers bit into her skin like iron clamps. His eyes skimmed her face, from her nose to her forehead, his breath coming short and harsh puffs against her hair. Then he blinked. The wildness went out of his face instantly, and he looked 20 years older. He looked down at the boy scrabbling back on his elbows, mouth open in fear. "Go," Zaelen told the kid. His voice was thick. The boy stood up, and he ran down the hall without a backward glance, leaving his tub of wood in the midst of the stones. Zaelen didn't release Vaelia's wrists at once. He relaxed his hold, and was only holding her hands, his thumbs stroking over the old scars on her knuckles in a rhythm. Now his hands shook, a little constant tremor in his fingers that he couldn't control. He waited for her to say anything to calm him down. Vaelia watched as his thumbs caressed her skin. Yesterday, she'd have felt sorry for him. She just felt tired today. She was 16, couldn't read, and was spending her nights preventing a warlord from killing the scullery maids because someone dropped a bucket. She drew her hands back to her chest. Zaelen's fingers hovered open in the air for a moment, then he lowered them to his sides. He looked at her face, his brow furrowing a fraction. "I'm going to bed," Vaelia said, and she didn't wait for him to turn. She walked past him to the residential doors, leaving him standing alone by the broken mugs. The council room reeked of wet dogs and tallow. Vaelia sat on a stool by the table, her hands in her lap so that no one could see her thumbs twitch. The sun was out on the snow outside the tall windows, glaring off the drifts until her head ached. They'd been scrapping over grain carts and border tolls since breakfast. Zaelen sat at the head of the table in his work leathers, looking like he wanted to slug someone. He'd sat her right next to him, and she hadn't understood a word anybody said. They were all provincial taxes and road toll. At the other end of the table, a man in a green velvet frock rose. He had a scroll with a red wax seal. "Your Grace," he gestured to the chair. Then his eyes moved to Vaelia. "The Lower Valley's tax assessments are completed. Maybe the girl could read out the room numbers. Just to save time." No one said anything. Vaelia felt her face drain of blood so fast her ears rang. The man in velvet walked to the end of the table and handed her the parchment in front of her. The ink was black and neat and even, but she couldn't read a letter of it. It looked like chicken scratch. She looked down at the paper, her chest tight. She had to swallow to get it out. I can't. Someone at the far end of the table snorted. A couple of the younger magistrates smiled and looked down at their sleeves. Then the whispering began, low, fast muttering among the men in velvet coats. She didn't have to hear the words. Bram's muckraker. Can't even read a tally sheet. Vaelia wished the floorboards would open and swallow her chair. Then the table was smashed. Zaelen slammed his fist down next to the scroll. The oak board cracked in the noise of a dry pine falling, and the parchment rolled to the floor. He got up. The skin around his mouth was white, his gray eyes fixed on the man in the green coat. Out, Zaelen said. The man looked surprised and retreated. Your Grace, it is a standard reading. I told you to get out, Zaelen said again, voice dropping into the flat dead register that terrified Bram. He squatted down and drew his dagger, driving the point into 2 inches of broken table board. Any man who looks at her next gets his tongue nailed to this post. Clear the room, will you? They didn't wait for him to draw the knife. Chairs scraped on the stones. Men jostled one another to get out the double doors into the hall. When the room was empty, Zaelen drew the dagger from the wood and slipped it back into its sheath. He swung to face her, his chest heaving, the anger vanishing from his face in a sudden rush. He caught her arm. Vaelia! She wouldn't let him touch her. She jumped up so fast she knocked her stool over and ran for the side door. She left the public wing, walked the scullery corridors, and pushed through into the winter gardens, where she paused to catch her breath. She sat on the edge of a stone planter, shaking her hands, crying because she couldn't help it. A moment later, a clean linen rag was tossed across her knee. It smelled of saddle soap and washing lye. Vaelia jumped and looked up, wiping her nose on her sleeve. General Marcus was on the gravel path, his white wool cloak wrapped around him, his hands tucked into his belt. He didn't look angry or self-satisfied. He just looked like an older guy who felt sorry for a dog with a broken leg. He shouldn't have done that. Marcus looked at the broken weeds in the planter. It was not fair to you. Vaelia looked down at her boots. He ordered them off. Marcus chuckled quietly. He was defending his property, girl, he said. He sat on the stone bench opposite her, his voice low and matter-of-fact. He shamed you before 20 squirearchs. By pulling that knife, he guaranteed every man in the province knows you can't read a standard tax roll. They don't respect you now. They just think he's gone crazy. Vaelia said nothing. Her stomach was a cold stone. Don't take it hard, Marcus went on, watching her face. Nobody expects Bram's girl to read Latin. You are not here to get your education. You're here because you shut him up at night. It stung a bit to hear him say it so casually. His head is broken, so he's leaning on you, said Marcus. And it works. Since Tuesday, no one has been in the infirmary. But see what it's doing to you. You're out here in the freezing wind crying over a piece of paper. When the night fever finally breaks, and he doesn't need someone to hold his hand in the dark anymore, he's going to need an empress from a landed family who can manage the border trade. Not some girl he has to save from a tally sheet. He stood, knocking the dry snow from his cloak, only keeping the house warm until the true mistress arrives, Vaelia. He turned and went back toward the path to the barracks, without waiting for her to answer. Vaelia sat on the planter until her feet went to sleep. Marcus hadn't said anything she didn't already know. He just said it out loud, so she couldn't pretend she hadn't heard it. She was just Bram's mucker in a clean frock. When Zaelen recovered, he would send her back to the stables. The heavy garden door ground open against the ice. Zaelen worked his way out onto the steps, glancing around until he spotted her by the planter. He didn't shout. He just stood in the wind, waiting for her to arrive. For the first time since they met, Vaelia didn't rise. She sat in the dark on her bed with her boots on. It was cold in the room. Zaelen had seen her face out there by the planter. After supper he'd tried to walk her back to his room, but she'd stopped at the stairwell and said she was tired. He'd stared at her for ages, his jaw working. I don't have you here to just hush the dark, he'd told her. Tonight I'll be in the guest room in the west wing. I'll show you I can take care of myself. Now she sat and listened to the creaking of the timber beams in the wind. The west wing was just across the courtyard, right over the laundry wash houses. Her room was too quiet without him sitting by the hearth, cleaning his boots. She looked at the door, wondering if he was asleep, or if Marcus was right about how bad his head was. 2 hours later, she heard the shouts from the courtyard. It wasn't the growl of a wolf. It was the sound of furniture smashing, heavy, violent smashes, and then a guard shouting for help. Vaelia didn't think of Marcus or the green velvet jacket. She ran out the door and down the stairs, slipping on the icy stones as she crossed the courtyard to the guest wing. As she came to the doorway, 2 guards backed out into the hallway, their spears in a defensive posture. The door was off its hinges, jammed in the doorframe. Vaelia pushed past it into the room. The washstand was shattered against the masonry, the feather bed was torn open, white down clinging to the blood on the floorboards. Zaelen knelt in the corner by the window, his hands fisted in his hair, his breath coming short and wet gasps. He looked as if he had no idea where he was. He was lost in whatever had happened in the winter campaign, not knowing the room around him. He couldn't do it alone. Vaelia stepped over the splintered wood, sank to her knees before him, and pulled his head into her lap. Zaelen immediately stopped shaking. He moaned long and raggedly, face buried in her coat, hands locked on her waist, hard enough to bruise. Warm and wet against her knees, his knuckles were bleeding through her skirts. "I couldn't," he said in a thick voice into her coat. "I couldn't get out of it." Vaelia looked down at the broken window glass on the ground. Marcus was right. He wouldn't be getting it here without her. But not because he cared for her. He just needed the crutch. As long as she sat here holding his head every time he had a bad night, he would never learn to fight it off on his own. She was keeping him sick, killing a warlord because she liked to feel needed. She reached across to the broken stand and found his roll of clean linen and set to wrapping his hands in the dark. She tied the knot over his split knuckles and set her mind. She had to leave. She had to take away the crutch so that he would be forced to stand up again by himself. The whole fortress stank of roasting grease and beeswax candles. The Feast of Victory was to be held at sundown, and the corridors had been busy since daybreak, with kitchen boys running tubs of ale and minor landholders arguing about their room assignments. Vaelia stood at her window, watching a pair of wagons trundle into the muddy courtyard below. 2 women in marten fur cloaks appeared on the stones, their drivers dragging iron-bound trunks down from the beds. It was said that Zaelen would announce an engagement tonight, near the scullery. Half the rich families between here and the coast had sent someone to sit at the high tables. She glanced at her bed. Her banquet dress was spread out across the blanket. Gray wool, plain, stitched with simple horn buttons at the wrists. No embroidery, no velvet edging, just like the winter work skirts Bram bought for the stable girls, only made of cleaner cloth that hadn't yet seen grease. The message was not difficult to read. He bought silk for the women who sat at the council table, and gave her a thick wool coat so she wouldn't catch cold when she sat up with him when his head went bad. Someone knocked 3 times with a heavy knuckle on the door. Vaelia opened the door. Zaelen stood in the hallway in his formal armor, a heavy black iron breastplate, and a sword belted over a clean linen tunic. He looked weary. His eyes were rimmed with red, and his jaw was tight, as if he hadn't slept since the window broke 2 nights ago. He did not walk in. He said, "The hall is a mess." His throat was hoarse. "Too many people talking over each other. Down there I can't think." Vaelia gazed at his hands. His knuckles were still swathed in the dirty linen she had wrapped around them in the dark. "Shall I close the window shutters of your room? I can sit by the fire until the seating begins." "No." He peered down the hall toward the stairs. Then he leaned in close enough to smell the oil on his armor. "Come down to the lower pens, just before the horns go for the meat course. Wait for me by the straw bales." Without waiting for an answer, he turned and hurried down the corridor toward the public wing, fast enough that 2 regional magistrates had to leap out of his way against the masonry. Vaelia stood in the open doorway until the stairwell wind made her shiver. Then she looked again at the gray woolen frock on her blanket. Down in the lower vault it was quiet when the iron doors settled into their latches. The sounds of the great hall above, fiddles, shouts, the heavy boots stamping on the floorboards, came through the ceiling timbers like distant thunder. Here it just smelled of wet straw and old salt crates, and the hound. Zaelen sat on an empty salt barrel against the back wall. He'd stripped off his iron breastplate and thrown it down. He was in his shirt sleeves and riding breeches, looking at the floor between his boots. At his feet the dire wolf slept, its great head on his ankle. A few yards away, Vaelia came down the steps and sat on a bale of hay. For 5 minutes they said nothing. The only sound was the heaving up and down of the wolf's ribs. "I used to hate this cellar," Zaelen said to the wall. "It was only when the beast had torn itself up on a trap or a boar tusk that I came down here in 12 years. It made sense in my own head." "And then you went downstairs." Vaelia stared at her thumbs, scraping some dried tallow from her fingernail. "You don't lie to me," he said. "Around here nobody talks unless they want a bit of land or a border toll." He pulled his ankle away from the dog's chin, dismounted the barrel, and knelt in the dirty straw right in front of her hay bale. He put his hands on her face, flat against her cheeks. His hands were calloused from sword hilts, smelled of saddle soap. "I don't like the magistrates," he muttered, tracing her cheekbone with his thumb. "I don't give a fig about the winter treaties. All I want—" The cellar doors above slammed against the masonry. Vaelia scrambled off the bale and dropped down onto her heels in the loose straw. A man wearing the white wool cloak of the Winter Council came down the stairs, flanked by 4 Vanguard guards with spears at the ready. The counselor was toting a black velvet pillow, and on it was the winter crown, a heavy circle of beaten silver, with rough red stones from the iron mines. "Your Grace, we need your seal on the settlement papers," the man said, bowing to Zaelen, and he did not look at Vaelia. He acted as though there was only the Emperor in the room. "The family from west is waiting by the dais. The horns are blowing for the sitting." Zaelen's jaw tightened. The open, tired look on his face left his eyes, and the hard, blank stare he had when he was handing out punishments in the yard took its place. He got to his feet, pulling his breastplate up from the floor by the straps. "Tell them I'm coming," he said. The alderman bowed again and walked back up the steps. Zaelen looked down at Vaelia, who was sitting in the dirt behind the hay bale. He opened his mouth, but what he was going to say remained there. He turned and followed the guards out, the heavy iron doors clanging shut behind him. The stable yard was full of horse shit and pine wind. Vaelia slipped out the side door into the dark courtyard. Above her, high in the sky, the great hall's leaded windows glowed yellow against the snow, and the sound of the brass horns, blowing the second salute, rolled across the roof slates. The feast was begun. General Marcus emerged from behind the timber woodshed. Tonight, he was not smiling. He wore a heavy sheepskin winter coat draped over his forearm, and a rolled piece of oiled hide stuck through his sword belt. "He's at the high table," Marcus said low. "Now he's standing between the 2 Western families. The silver crown is sitting on the salt block." Vaelia looked up to the yellow windows, but her eyes were dry, and her chest was cold and tight. "You saw the silver piece down cellar, girl," Marcus said, coming over to her. "Do you really think a warlord would put a silver crown on a girl who can't read a feed bill? When his head is sick, he comes down to the straw, but he has got to sit in that chair up yonder when the sun comes up." He held out the heavy sheepskin coat. "Go," Marcus told her. His voice was hoarse, but not unfriendly. "Go before he sends a kitchen boy to fetch you in to sit by his stool while he marries the Western girl." I bade the sentries at the timber gate to go sit by the fire till midnight. The valley road is open. Vaelia squinted at the coat. If she stayed, she'd just be Bram's old mucker sitting in a clean dress while he tried to run a war. The next 10 years, she'd hold his hands in the dark, while some other woman ran his house in the daylight. And every time his head got bad, she'd be right there stopping him from getting strong enough to handle it himself. She couldn't live like that. She took the sheepskin coat from his hands and drew it over her wool dress. She pulled the rolled map from his belt, without a word. "Go on," said Marcus, nodding to the back wall. "The snow's coming down again hard. It'll fill your tracks by morning." Vaelia didn't look back at the lit windows. She didn't think of the hound in the cellar, or how Zaelen's palms felt against her face. She whirled and raced across the frozen mud toward the back wall. The wooden gate was unlatched, just as he'd promised. She opened it and stepped out on the mountain road, drawing the wood to behind her. She set off along the path into the trees, and the wind struck her at once, icy cold and smelling of pine. The wind through the pass was pushing her sideways. Vaelia was now up to her thighs in snowdrifts, pulling one foot out of the powder only to plunge the other down. There was no paving up here, just a timber track, covered in ice, sharp shale. An hour ago her boots had filled with snowmelt, her feet going from burning to completely numb before she hit the tree line. The garrison horn sounded twice down in the valley. Vaelia stopped, leaned against a dead pine, and listened. The sound was clean, but thin and metallic across the distance, the midday salute. The feast was done, and she was doing it now. She closed her eyes and put her forehead to the rough bark. She could see the entire thing, Zaelen by the salt block in his black armor, removing that heavy silver crown from the velvet pillow and setting it on the head of some Western girl in a velvet dress. Someone who could read a grain ledger without looking like a fool. She made a dry, ugly noise in her throat. She wiped her face with her sleeve, rasping her skin on the sheepskin wool. Marcus's oiled leather map was still tucked inside her coat, but the wet had already crept to the edges. It didn't matter. There was only one trail leading up the ridge. If she stepped on the stone markers, she'd be out of the province before night. She'd be just another girl looking for work on a farm in the border towns. The clouds over the ridge had hung low and gray and blocked out the sun altogether. Then the snow began to come down hard, not the light powder of the morning, but thick wet sheets that blew horizontally across the gap. Her boot tracks were gone in 10 minutes. The storm was covering the trail behind her, hiding any evidence she'd ever been down in the valley. Vaelia pushed away from the pine. She pushed her leg forward into the next drift. It was as if she breathed frost, her lungs. She just had to get over the ridge before her knees gave out. The cold wasn't hurting him. It felt like a lead weight on her legs. Vaelia snagged her toe on a root beneath the snow and fell hard to her side. Her heavy sheepskin coat was twisted around her knees, holding her down in the drifts. There she lay, with her cheek on the crust, too tired to free herself. Anyhow, it was easier to stay down. She could hear the iron on the iron through the wind. It was not the garrison trumpets. From the fortress came a heavy, irregular clanging, fast and messy and loud. The warning bells. Bram had said they only rang the great bells if the timber gates were broken or the barracks caught fire. It sounded like a panic in the whole yard. Vaelia blinked at the gray sky. Her head was heavy and sluggish. She wondered if some visiting lord had quarreled in the hall. The shouting began, and she wondered if Zaelen was reaching for his sword, looking for someone to quiet him down. It didn't make any difference. She couldn't walk up the hill, let alone walk down it. The snow now felt so cozy, pulling her down into the dark. The clamor from the valley was as if it came from underwater. Her hands were frozen. It didn't matter much anymore. Marcus's speech on border treaties. The embarrassment about the tax rolls just melted away, lying there waiting for the cold to do its job. She didn't know Latin. That didn't matter. It didn't matter that the magistrates snubbed her, or that Zaelen had to have an educated wife to run his province. She still loved him. She liked the way he sat on that salt barrel with his boots in the straw. She liked his rough, scarred hands, and the way he quietly talked to the hound. She'd left because she thought she was destroying him. But the real truth was, she would have stayed in that cold cellar with him the rest of her life, if he'd just asked her to stay. Vaelia closed her eyes and let the snow fall on her coat. Something hit the ground close to her head, hard enough to rattle the ice beneath her cheek. He did not look up. She was half dreaming of Bram's kitchen fire, adrift in a quiet space where her feet did not ache. The thud was an old tree shedding a branch in the wind, she thought. Then the snow was brushed off her face. The smell of pine trees died away, to be replaced by saddle grease, horse lather, and wet wool. Someone grabbed her by the arms and pulled her out of the drift. She was jerked against a solid wall of iron plating. The cold melted in the heat of the man holding her. Vaelia. He spoke in a hoarse, breathless voice, as if he'd been running up the grade. She forced her eyes open, squinting against the falling snow. The old stone border post stood a yard off. Zaelen was there, kneeling in the slush, cradling her in his chest. He did not have his cloak on, and he was not wearing the silver crown. He was dressed only in his black work tunic and riding boots, his hair plastered to his forehead with wet snow. Behind him, his horse stood with its head down, the chest white with foam from the climb. He was really here. He had climbed the mountain road in the midst of a blizzard. Zaelen buried his face in her neck, breathing hard and raggedly. He smelled of horses and wet iron. "I've got you," he said, rubbing his rough hands up and down her arms to get the blood moving. "See me. I've got you." Vaelia was too muddle-headed to grasp it. He had no business on that ridge. He was meant to be at the high table with the family from the west. Her brain told her that this was the vision you had just before you froze to death. You saw what you wanted to see. She didn't lean on his coat. She pressed her cold palms to his leather vest and pushed him away with all her strength. "No," she rasped. It almost sounded like a word. Zaelen stopped, his hand still on her shoulders. She turned her eyes away from him to the rough stone of the border marker. She put her hands on his chest, trying to get her breath back so she could tell him to get away from her. The wind off the ridge was so loud she had to shout to be heard. Vaelia's palms stayed flat against his vest, pushing him back. She expected him to fly into a rage. If you said no to a soldier in the lower yards, you usually got knocked down for it. Zaelen just stayed there, on his knees in the slush, letting her shove him. He smelled of wet horse and saddle soap, his body heat bleeding through her coat, and she wanted to just close her eyes and stop fighting. But the words of Marcus's speech about the tax rolls were echoing in her ears. Vaelia squinted at the stinging snow. "You don't care a damn about me," she said. Her teeth chattered so much she bit her tongue. Zaelen's jaw muscle twitched, but he didn't flinch. She grabbed his leather tabard, her fingers numb and barely able to close round it. "You just need someone to sit there so the dark don't get to you," she yelled over the wind. "Just Bram's old mucker holding the candle. As soon as you're right in the head and you can sleep on your own, you'll throw me back in the stables. I will not do it. Let go, my coat." She waited for him to come up with a smooth magistrate's answer about how much he appreciated her service. No, he didn't. He just stared at her with pale, washed-out eyes, his face wet with melting snow. Then he checked within his tunic and drew out his belt pouch. He reached into the leather bag and drew out his stamping block. It was a heavy piece of iron, 2 inches square, engraved with the head of the hound that he used to stamp provincial warrants and feeding orders. It was the only evidence which the magistrates accepted when he demanded grain or imposed taxes. Vaelia glanced at it. Her nose was running. She blew it on her sleeve. Zaelen didn't make a speech about his legacy. He simply picked up the iron block and hurled it sidearm over the edge of the road and down into the ravine. It struck the trees somewhere down below and made no other sound. "I had this road before I had a stamp," Zaelen said to her. "If they want to discuss who is in charge of the valley, we can do it with iron." He leaned in and touched his forehead to hers. His nose was cold as ice, but his mouth was hot as fire on her skin. "I am tired of people asking me for things," he muttered. "I won't go back down there without you." The knot in her stomach unknotted in one go. A man didn't get rid of his tax stamp just to have a nurse around. He didn't want a poultice. He wanted her. She released his vest and threw her arms around his neck, her cold fingers slipping under his tunic collar to the warm skin of his throat. She was going to reply to him when a stone chipped her boot. Something struck the border post with a hard thwack. A short, fat crossbow bolt stuck out of the pine post, quivering 2 inches from her shoulder. Vaelia jumped, boots slipping in the slush. A dozen men stepped out of the timber along the ridgeline. They wore the black iron mail of the Vanguard garrison, but they didn't have their garrison cloaks. They picked their way gingerly through the drifts, cocking their crossbows for a second shot. General Marcus stepped out behind them. He wore his heavy sheepskin coat, his sword already out of its scabbard. He was no longer an uncle dispensing advice. He was an officer dealing with a mutiny. They hadn't come up here to talk. They'd followed the horse's trail in the fresh fallen snow, waiting until Zaelen was out of sight of the watchtowers. "You are always too pig-headed for your own good, Zaelen," Marcus stated. He didn't yell. He just spoke loud enough to be heard over the wind. "The valley needs a man who can read a treaty, not a man playing in the dirt with Bram's yard girl. Take him." 3 of the soldiers raised their crossbows, aiming the iron points at Zaelen's chest. Vaelia moved without realizing that she had moved. She blocked Zaelen from the road, arms out to her sides. It was stupid. A wool coat wouldn't stop a crossbow bolt, but she did it. Zaelen cursed under his breath. He didn't bother to argue. He took her by the scruff of her sheepskin coat and dragged her hard behind him, stepped square into the middle of the road to cover her. His broadsword grated loudly from its scabbard. He didn't seem to be ill. There was no wild, empty stare in his eyes. His hands did not tremble. The nightmares did not bother him anymore. He was an old soldier standing on a frozen road, looking at 10 men he used to pay, getting ready to kill them. Crossbows thwacked, flat notes that barely carried on the wind. Vaelia ducked and grabbed for Zaelen's sleeve, but he was already moving. He did not try to duck or swing at the bolts, just turned his left side to them, letting the thick iron plates of his back armor take the hit. 2 bolts bounced off his shoulder guard with a loud clatter, and a third knocked a splinter off the pine post behind her. Then he was one of them. Vaelia, watching him, slipped in the slush and caught herself on her bare hands. This time it wasn't a dream. No growling, not the blind swinging he did in his bedroom. He just looked like a man who had lived his whole life, fighting in winter mud. Before the man could drop his empty string, he was inside the reach of the first soldier, taking his knees out with the flat of his blade. The pine wind carried the smell of wet iron and fresh blood. Marcus was retreating toward the trees, trying to free his longsword from his sheepskin coat. He appeared to be surprised. He'd brought his men up here expecting to deal with a fever case who swung wild and left himself open. Zaelen stepped over the man on the ground and went right at him. "You thought she made me soft," Zaelen said. It was no shout, merely a low, hard voice through the wind. His sword flashed down. Marcus got his own blade up to catch it, but the weight of the iron snapped the steel just above the hilt. Zaelen didn't stab him. He just smacked the heavy pommel of his sword into Marcus's chest and sent him reeling back into the slush by the border post. The white woolen cloak absorbed the mud at once. Marcus lay there, trying to breathe, his hands digging uselessly into the icy gravel. It was all done in 40 seconds. 3 men were down in the slush, and the rest were backing away toward the timber, with their empty hands out, showing they'd had enough. Zaelen did not follow them into the trees. With a metallic rattle, he only sheathed his sword and turned his back on them. He walked back to Vaelia, his boots crunching in the crust. He was breathing hard, but his pale gray eyes were steady as he looked her up and down, checking her coat for blood. He didn't need anyone to hold his hand and keep the dark away. The headaches didn't disappear by magic. He just had a job in front of him that was more important than his own mood. About mid-morning, the snow ceased. The pale sun came out from behind the clouds, clearing off the white ridges until Vaelia had to squint to see the road. She sat side-saddle on the horse, leaning back against Zaelen's chest. He kept one hand on the reins and the other arm around her waist to keep her from sliding off the wet leather. The wind was still keen, but with the bulk of his body behind her, she was warm enough. For the first time since Bram had sent her down to the cellar, she didn't feel like she was waiting for someone to hit her. She rested her shoulders against his tunic, allowing the walking gait of the horse to rock her. Zaelen rested his chin on her head. "Hold on a moment," Zaelen said to the horse. The animal halted, its hoofs driving deep into the drift. They were half a mile down from the ridge, right by the drainage culvert, where he'd thrown his iron stamping block. Zaelen dropped his arm from her waist, swung down out of the saddle, and landed in the slush. Vaelia looked on as he crossed the ditch, kicking away a pile of dirty snow with his boot, reaching down into the dead weeds. He got to his feet, holding the square black iron stamp in his hand. He wiped the wet mud off the hound's carved head with his thumb and went back to the horse. He did not put the iron block back in his belt pouch. He reached across and plopped the heavy metal in Vaelia's lap. She caught it with both hands, surprised again at its weight, and looked down at him. "You said I only wanted a quiet room," Zaelen said, squinting up at her against the sun. "I threw that in the weeds to show you I didn't care about the taxes, so I picked it up again, so you could help me decide what to do with the valley." The last vestige of her pride was gone. He wasn't giving her some great title or making a speech about her virtue. He was just giving her the tools because he trusted her to use them. Vaelia slipped the heavy iron block inside her sheepskin coat to keep it dry, looked down at his scraped face, and gave him a small, tired smile. "Let's get out of the wind." You could hear the noise from the great hall out by the laundry sheds. Vaelia was in the corridor, outside the double doors, still in Bram's old gray wool dress under her sheepskin coat, her hair damp with snow, her boots splashing dirty puddles on the clean flagstones. Zaelen stood beside her, in his work leathers. His tunic was wet, and his knuckles still bound with the dirty bandages she'd wrapped around him in the dark. He pretended not to care who saw him. He reached for her hand and grabbed it, the calloused palm closing firmly over her fingers. "Open it," he ordered the sentries. The 2 guards pushed against the big oak doors and pushed them open. The hall was full. 300 people sat comfortably along the timber tables in their velvet coats, marten furs, and gold chains. listening to the fiddling up on the gallery. The people around the door saw the muddy boots of Zaelen and stopped talking. Then the silence ran down the tables like a wave, until even the fiddlers noticed and stopped playing in mid-song. 100 heads turned toward the door. 2 women from the Western families stood by the salt block on the dais in their clean white dresses, waiting for the ceremony to begin. One of them saw Vaelia's sheepskin coat, and her mouth dropped open. Vaelia's heart thumped against her ribs, but the old urge to hide under the table did not come back. She had the iron stamping block in her coat pocket, and Zaelen's hand in hers. She raised her chin. Zaelen didn't release her hand. He marched her straight up the middle aisle, boots tracking gray mountain slush all over the clean floor. They went up the steps to the platform. There on a black velvet pillow lay the silver crown with its red ironstones. Zaelen looked around the room. For 12 years, he said, his voice reaching the back wall without him having to shout. You people have brought me silk coats and tax petitions. He looked down at the old magistrate who'd brought the parchment to the table this morning. The man stared hard at his plate. No one ever asked if the hounds were fed, Zaelen said. He looked down at her. Before she knew who I was, she'd be sitting in a freezing cellar fixing a dog's leg. That makes her more used to this valley than any other here. He dropped her hand and reached across the pillow for the silver crown. He did not make a ceremony of it. He placed the silver circle on her snow-wet, tangled hair. The rough red stones looked entirely out of place above the collar of Bran's old sheepskin coat. But nobody down at the tables laughed. Sit, Zaelen ordered the room, as clear an order as he'd ever stamped as a warrant. He didn't have to shout it. The magistrates and their wives scrambled back to their seats at the tables, eyes on their trenchers, chairs scraping on the floorboards. Vaelia looked at the room of velvet coats, felt Zaelen's hand back to catch hers, and felt warm.